Okie dokie. I have been trying to understand how stories work. And when I look into people explaining stories, mostly talking about writing, there's a couple different ways that they do it. One, they'll talk about, the 3-act structure. There's the way things were, there's an inciting incident, conflict, change, and then like things, the denouement. It doesn't give me enough of a sense of like what's driving the story. It's almost more like it's saying, well, looking back on this, we can see that there's 3 parts. Or like it's easy to divide this into 3 parts so that people can understand it. But that doesn't really describe to me what makes a good story, and also kind of like what makes people tick or what drives the action. Sometimes people say you have to have the character and you have to have something that they want, right? There's something that they want, and then there's something that gets in the way of what they want. And that makes sense to a point as well, except I think that's a little bit misleading, because what most people and what a lot of characters want are the same things. Like they want safety, they want love. If they have a really big ambition, it's usually in the pursuit of safety and love. In a way, we're not that complicated. But I thought of a framing this morning that makes more sense to me and gives me a little bit more to chew on when I'm thinking about what drives a story. A couple months ago, there was a short where I think Brennan Lee Mulligan was talking about how it's the decision-making of the characters that's the most interesting thing in a story. And I had mulled that over for a while. I was like, yeah, that's true. You're presented with a conflict or a challenge. How do you decide what it is that you're going to do? And I sat with that and I was like, yeah, that is quite interesting. Like that makes it not just about what happens to the character, but how they respond. And I think that's super valid. But this morning I was thinking that there's another way of framing it that makes even more sense to me and also ties it in with how I think the world works in terms of like biology, at least. And that is looking at it as what is the character's strategy for getting what they want? And then how do things change and how do they adapt their strategy to get what they want? That might not sound super groundbreaking to anyone else, but it makes a lot of sense to me. In evolution, there's this concept of punctuated equilibrium. And that says that evolution isn't happening like every single generation. There's like these incremental changes and it's kind of a smooth line. And things are always just drifting away from whatever their origin point was at this like continuous rate. Rather, punctuated equilibrium is like, okay, so there was this body shape or strategy that worked for a while, and then something changes in the external environment. And then there's this uptick of them having to change rapidly. And then once they change to adjust, as long as they don't go extinct, once they change to adjust to that environmental change, then it'll stay pretty steady for a while after that. So it looks a little bit like this, where the first graph is continuous change and the second graph is that punctuated equilibrium. So things are working for a while, and then as a response to an external change, then there's this accelerated change in response to that to try to adapt, and then they can cruise for a while with that. So in a story, when you have that sort of status quo of what the character's strategy has been, and then that change in circumstance, that's where the tension is created. Because it's sort of like that change in circumstance is trying to push the strategy in a different direction, and they'll resist it for a while. And then depending on how the story goes, maybe they adapt successfully, or maybe they don't adapt at all, or they try to adapt and it doesn't work out quite right. So for example, in A Wind in the Door, a fabulous Madeline L'Engle book, Meg's strategy for her life is when she comes up against injustice or bullies, whether that's bullies of her own age or like the principal who's a bully, her strategy is to fight back and be angry and like try to hold that boundary with anger, which I think is valid, by the way. But then when the circumstances change and the real antagonists, the Ichthroi, who are this sort of like negating force in the universe, they're this like black holes, but worse. It's just like they're nixing things. When they show up, fighting him in the same way no longer works because they're feeding off of the anger, hatred, and division. And so she has to change her strategy to actually finding the humanity within this this very flawed human being, Mr. Jenkins, and love him. And that's the only way that she's gonna save the world, basically. Yeah, it's not so much that what she wants changes, but her strategy has to change. I was also noticing that in a story, there's the most inner turmoil for someone when they don't know what their strategy should be next. And that could be either because they just don't know what's going to work, or because it seems like a change in strategy would also go against their values in some way. And they're having trouble reconciling that with their values. I think too that manipulators are really disconcerting because they will change their strategy like rapid fire, like multiple times in one conversation sometimes, depending on how subtle they are. But they'll use any strategy to get what they want. And I think that rubs us the wrong way, one, because they might be screwing people over, but two, because normally our strategies are rooted in our values. And for them to be freely moving between whatever strategy really shows that they don't have a lot of values, giving them sort of like this compass in life. For a hero to change their strategy and for us to still trust them, they have to have some sort of noble goal. And in a story, when a new and really surprising strategy is used and it works, it's really thrilling. If it's something that we would have never thought of, or something that seems so risky that it seems like it shouldn't work, and it does, that can be really, really exciting. I think of heist movies like Ocean's 11, or similarly, once again, yes, I watch a lot of Dimension 20. In a recent episode, there has been a particular strategy in the group for this whole campaign, and that strategy is secrecy. Secrecy equals safety. And then, towards the end of the campaign, one of the players, without really getting anyone else on board, completely tells the truth and exposes what they're doing. And the tension, the exquisite, delicious, dramatic tension in the room is insane because every other player is like, oh no, my strategy. Like all of our strategy, you're burning it to the ground. What are we going to do? We didn't plan for this. And fantastically, it actually works out. And it's electric because no one was expecting that. So yeah, those are my thoughts on storytelling and how thinking about strategy can give us a clearer view of how characters are making decisions and what drives tension in a plot.